Randolph Bracialarghe of Nova Southeastern University is with us on the program once again. Professor, how you doing, sir?
Well, I'm fine, thank you.
Appreciate you joining us again. And a new article in the Sun Sentinel down there. Disallowing guns doesn't improve safety. I got to say, I could not agree more with the premise of your piece here. The issue is not guns on campus, but whose hands will hold those guns. So, first of all, I got to ask, why do you keep writing about this issue, Professor?
Well, I'll tell you, it's something that obviously not just here in Florida, but I suspect all over the country people have been discussing for years. And we discuss it much more with every public shooting. And now that it looks like terrorism is ramping up its ugly head in this country, it's more important to bring awareness to this. Now, just to answer your question more specifically, I actually wrote 3 articles. And the first one I wrote was for the Tallahassee Democrat. Tallahassee is our state capital. And that's when the legislators were debating passing a bill that would permit people to bring guns on campus so they have a concealed carry permit. When that failed, the legislature didn't vote on it. They adjourned. Then I wrote another one in more detail, and that was for the Miami Herald. That's the southern part of the state, most populous part of the state, explaining more in detail some of the tragedy that happens when you ignore as the legislature did, this necessity that we start protecting ourselves. And this last one was also, again, in Fort Lauderdale. Again, this is the most populous part of our state, these 3 counties. Mm-hmm. Was to talk about public places, because maybe most people aren't thinking about campuses, but let's talk about the public places. So I discussed in that article the examples of horrendous tragedies when we take guns away from or prohibit law-abiding people from having guns to defend themselves and leave it up to the criminals. And so that I want to discuss public places to see if I could bring that home, because there's always a chance our legislature is going to go back into session. And I know that the NRA in Tallahassee, Marion Hammer, does excellent work, is going to be doing something about that, trying to get them to reconsider. That's why.
Well, listen, I appreciate, again, everything that you say about this. And, you do point out, and I know that, there are some folks, they don't want to hear this. It makes them uncomfortable. We're thinking about awful circumstances. We're thinking about people dying needlessly when we talk about these murders at Luby's in Killeen, Texas, or you talk about the Long Island Railroad. Yes.
Yeah. Well, you're right. You say when we don't want to think about it. Well, that's exactly the problem. The problem is it's not going away. I mean, I think, as I said in the article, we can ignore reality, but that doesn't mean we can avoid the consequences of ignoring reality. And as you pointed out in the article, I addressed it. Just think about some of these things. What do these incidents have in common? Luby's Restaurant, the Long Island Railroad Massacre, Fort Hood, the Norwegian Youth Camp, the Century Theater in Aurora, Westland Mall in Nairobi, Charlie Hebdo. And what they have in common is that guns weren't permitted. And for me, in Charlie Hebdo, they even had a police officer who wasn't armed, right? But for me, the most poignant example, I mean, think about everyone you know who thinks this is dangerous, and it's quite a few, certainly among law professors and professors. I think this is a minority view, but they all don't think we should have guns. Well, let's take a look at what I think is the most poignant example, and that's in Mumbai, India. India had very strict gun control laws, very, very strict. I mean, if you want the kind of paradise that these people are talking about, let's take away guns from every people. You had it in Mumbai, and what happened in Mumbai? You had some terrorists who came over from probably Pakistan. They went to India's largest city, and they just shot everybody they encountered because they're the only ones who had guns. They came in by boat, and the police, the police didn't have to be armed because nobody else had guns. So the police, brave individuals, waved their bamboo sticks at the terrorists and say, "Put away those guns." Terrorists shot them. Now, why is that poignant? Because that's exactly the society that people who disagree with your listeners want. A society where we're all vulnerable. I mean, let me make a couple examples, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One is, recently, if I'd written this article after 2 days later, I would have contrasted with Garland, Texas. Now, what happened in Garland, Texas? What happened was one individual, an officer, and I wish you'd interview him, even if he doesn't give his name for obvious reasons, because I'm willing to bet that he wasn't taught to shoot on the police force. He was taught to shoot probably as a boy, growing up in Texas. And so he stopped 2 terrorists who were there with the intention of mass murder. Now, Garland, Texas, I mean, Texas alone, at least for, I guess, many Americans, certainly for me, it's synonymous with bravery, liberty, self-defense. I mean, you think of the Alamo, right?
Mm-hmm.
Contrast that, Texas, right? Of all the places you're going to commit mass murder, or try to, Texas is about the dumbest. Unless you can ensure that you're going to be someplace such as a fort where people are disarmed, right? I mean, if you're going to go to a fort where they're forcibly disarmed, where the federal government disarms, then that's another story. But compare that to the Tsarnaev brothers. How were the Tsarnaev brothers caught? They weren't caught by the police. First of all, they were identified because of private cameras, not government cameras, private cameras from the stores in that area. They were turned in, or the police were alerted by a private individual, a cab driver, not a police officer. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And how was the last one found? He was found by a private individual who ignored the warnings of the police, left his house, went outside for a smoke, and discovered him. So it's completely absurd to rely on the police. It kind of reminds me, I don't know if you're probably not old enough to remember this, but in 1960, when John F. Kennedy was running for the presidency against, and I'm talking about the Democratic primary now, against
Right.
Lyndon Johnson, they were talking about, he actually talked to the Texas delegation. He was invited to speak to the Texas delegation because Lyndon Johnson had quite a bit of clout. People don't remember that. I mean, if you read Robert Caro's books, it brings it back. But and they're talking about the bravery of the Alamo and the Texans who stood for liberty there against all odds, as the Texans always have. I mean, that's part of their culture. They're kind of like the Marines of the American states. And Kennedy tells the story as he said, well, what about Paul Revere? And a Texan shouts out, yeah, he's the guy who ran for help. Well, that pretty much sums it up. It sums up Texas. It sums up the difficulty of relying on the police to protect you. And it doesn't work. Look at Mumbai. So that almost, for me, that closes the deal. It just makes no sense. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to remind people of that because I've had a lot of people come up to me. As I told you before, I teach law school faculty.
Mm-hmm.
These people are very smart. They're very good. They're very tolerant of opposing points of view. Mine being one example. And a lot of them said they congratulated me on the article. They said it was well thought out, well expressed. They just don't agree. I didn't say why they don't agree, but it's because they don't want to take that next step.
Yeah, absolutely. No, in fact, Ronald Noble, who at the time was the head of Interpol at the Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi, Kenya, he talked to ABC News afterwards, and he said it had really got him thinking. He said, there are a couple of ways that we as a society can deal with these types of attacks. We can try to harden every possible target out there and multiple layers of security, and he said it's going to be really difficult. Really, it's going to be impossible to do. And he said, or we can start thinking about the benefits of an armed citizenry. And he actually said, he said, if people would think about where would you want to be? Would you rather have been in Kenya where the gun control laws restrict, where nobody had a gun? Or would you have wanted to be in a mall in Colorado or Texas? And he mentioned Texas as one of those places where it'd be likely that you would find an armed citizen who could respond, or 2 or 3, until police did arrive. He actually brought this up, the head of Interpol. And I think that, that is a mindset that maybe security professionals are thinking about. Members of the military, our veterans are thinking about and saying these things. But, as you say, there is that mindset. And I think even you look at the events of Garland, and there are a lot of people who want to say, look, if I just keep my head down, if I keep my mouth shut, if I don't say anything to bother anybody, if I don't do anything to tick off anybody, I don't need to think about these things. I'll be perfectly fine.
Well, it reminds me of something else. I think when you and I spoke on Monday, I mentioned to kill bacteria and to prevent disease, and how some people, curiously enough, the very people who are making this a cause célèbre are the people, saying, well, you've got to vaccinate your kids. And I'm not disagreeing with that. You have to vaccinate. They're the very ones who want to close their eyes to this type of danger. And it reminded me, the founders were descended from people who came here, and for the most part, on the eastern seaboard, they didn't have to fight, for the most part, to get land to build their settlements. And the reason they didn't have to, again, for the most part, is because the Indians were not inoculated against European diseases, against smallpox. So when you have a society that's completely open to that, the society dies when a bacterium is introduced that it's not able to handle. And I think that's pretty much what happened in Mumbai, to use that analogy again. It's the very same thing. There was no one there who was inoculated who had a gun. It makes all of us weaker.
Talking again with Randolph Bracilarge, professor of law at Nova Southeastern University, and you talked about the reception from your colleagues and how a lot of them have said, congratulations, I just disagree with you. The fact that they're reading this, I have to say, Professor, I think is a good sign, because sooner or later, if they keep reading, it might be discomforting to them to read what you have to say. But it's the type of stuff that sticks with you, I think, and maybe nags at you in the back of your mind. Well, what about this? Really, as you say, these are smart people. They don't want to hold positions that are sort of untenable. So I hope that you've left a couple of thoughts for them to chew on.
Well, I think it's something else that you and I spoke about on Monday, and that's that there are some opinions in this society that that are considered by the whatever you want to call them, the elite, the conoscente, the talking
I say it's the betters versus the bumpkins. That's my phrase.
Right, and exactly, and so that's a very hard wall to get over, because if your logic leads you to one position, and that's the position that you don't want to be in, you don't take that last step. You refuse to take it because it's going to lead you where and I think that's the hardest thing to get over, is that since this is not, everybody likes to be liked, everybody likes to be thought intelligent, and you don't want to accept a point of view that I don't know if you have time, but I have another analogy for you.
Sure.
It's I don't know how many people anymore read Origin of the Species, but we accept evolution as not as it's a science, by the way, but we accept it as a religion. And it's what's curious about it is that if you read Chapter 6 of Origin of the Species, Darwin says, here are the problems that I have with my theory that I can't surmount. And so yet knowing that, having read Darwin, having read Origin of the Species, understanding the biology of it, understanding the geology, there are scientific reasons, in other words, Darwin's reasons, you don't have to take anybody else's, to question his own theory. But yet today, if you or I or any other educated person says, well, I have my doubts about evolution, then we're thought to be idiots. Now, by the way, the person who first awakened me to this was my geology professor, the head of the geology department in Michigan when I was an undergrad. A very smart man. So I came upon it as a science. I still look at it as a science. But a lot of my good friends, very intelligent people, by the way, who didn't study geology, who haven't read Origin of the Species, they view it, for them, they don't recognize it's religion. They think, well, this is a science. This is what intelligent people think. So it's very hard publicly to get anyone to say it. I mean, look at Governor Walker. He goes to England to talk about one thing. They ask him about evolution, and he's unable to address it. He hasn't read Darwin. I don't care, but then at least if you don't run for president, guy. But he's afraid. He realizes that if he says, well, I question it, and all he really had to say, there's a point to this. All he really had to say was, I have the same reservation as Darwin had in Chapter 6, right? But instead, he doesn't do it. And the relationship to guns is the same thing. Very intelligent people don't want to say, well, I think we just have to have guns if we're going to stop these terrorists, because they realize that that's not the intelligent position. And so it doesn't matter what you or I or anybody else says or write, unless we can get over that last hurdle, which is no one wants to be thought to be a rube.
I guess, yeah. I've never minded, I suppose, but I do understand completely that you're right. It is that peer pressure doesn't go away just when you leave high school. And as a matter of fact, I'm sure that the peer pressure among academics and professors might be much worse than you would find as a high school student, right? The pressure to say the right thing and to feel the right way, to support the right causes, and that would extend far beyond the world of academia. There are those. It is an act of defiance in a way, an act of rebellion when a celebrity comes out as pro-gun, right? And all of a sudden, oh, really? Vince Vaughn's libertarian. Wow, I didn't know that. Because you are defying the odds, and you are, defying the stereotype. And there is that wonder of, okay, what are the political and professional consequences going to be for those individuals? It is actually, I think it goes far beyond just the gun issue, where we have to work on knocking down those boundaries. But let me ask you specifically about academia, because it seems like we're becoming more polarized on college campuses politically. It seems like we're going in the opposite direction.
Well, I don't know about polarized, but I think you're right, definitely about academia in this sense. If you and I are running a business for profit, and we decide that we're going to do something that other people aren't doing, then if it succeeds, other people will copy us. In other words, they don't care about our opinions, just it does this work. The problem with academia is that it's our ideas. That's our product. And just to give you an example, and then I'll address the polarization. When I was in college, for a brief moment, I thought, well, maybe I'll become a professor of history. But a friend of mine who did that, I remember I wrote him. He was studying in England, and I was in Rome at the time. And I wrote him a letter. He was at Cambridge, and I said, I just read this book about Stalin. What do you think about X and Y? And his answer to me was not, well, that's mistaken, or I agree with it. His answer was, Randolph, no one believes that. In other words, he was already preparing to become a professor. He knew there are only certain rules you can have, certain positions you could take. Now, as far as becoming more polarized, I think what happens is this. If you believe, and I say you, I should really say one, if one believes that one's position is correct and no other position is acceptable, then when one interviews other people, if they don't share that position, then they're obviously not intelligent, and you can't hire them. And so to the extent it's becoming more polarized, as you said, and I think you're right, I think that helps to explain it. It is, we say we want diversity, but, and maybe in our hearts we believe we do, but our actions don't always show that, at least not diversity of opinion or diversity of point of view. Because think about this. If I may, in defense of these people that I don't agree with, if you were hiring for a geology department or a science department, and the candidate believed the Earth was flat, and you would fall off the end, he would say, well, he's ignorant, I'm not going to hire him. Well, that point of view is, I think, how they look at differing points of view on things like guns. And that's why it's becoming more polarized. I think that's why I think you're right. That's why it's becoming more polarized. It's because they only hire people who have this point of view.
Professor, listen, it is a pleasure talking with you. I really appreciate you coming on the program. Hope that we can do this again in the future, sir.
I enjoyed it.
Me too.
Look forward to it.
Professor Randolph Bracelargue joins us, Professor of Law at Nova Southeastern University, here on NRA News, Cam and Company.